Ever wondered what it's like to steer a ship through hell? No, I'm not speaking figuratively. I mean an actual, literal hell, a place where reality melts like wax and nightmares come alive with a gurgling laugh. Picture an endless, turbulent ocean made of the fears of every living soul, its waves crashing against the thin hull of your ship. Now imagine you're the poor soul tasked with navigating that ocean, blindfolded, save for a single cursed eye in your forehead that can see the madness beyond. Sound horrifying? Welcome to my life. My name isn't important. Just know that I am a navigator of the Imperium of Man. One of those strange, pale figures with a third eye in the middle of the forehead, the ones you hear hushed rumors about on void stations, the mutant nobles who guide starships through the Immaterium so humanity can span a galaxy. That's me. Without people like me, you'd be stuck on whatever forgotten rock you call home, praying for someone to invent a faster ship. With us, you get to cross the stars in weeks instead of millennia. Convenient, right? Just don't ask about the cost. They call it the warp, or the Empyrean, or the Immaterium. But none of those names quite capture the sheer, mind-rending insanity of it. I've heard voidsmen try to compare it to a stormy sea or an endless night sky. Cute analogies, but they fall short. A stormy sea doesn't whisper your deepest fears back at you. A night sky doesn't suddenly sprout grasping claws of raw unreality trying to tear your ship apart. The warp does all that and worse, and only we navigators can open our eye to it and chart a path through, guided by the Emperor's holy beacon shining from Terra. Only we can look directly into the nightmare and not lose our minds. Well, at least not immediately. I won't lie to you, it's a job that comes with, let's say, occupational hazards. Some people get workplace injuries. I get my soul nearly eaten by predatory warp entities if I'm unlucky. There's a reason navigators don't exactly top the list of cheerful, carefree citizens in the Imperium. Most of us cope with our fate using a mix of dry humor, expensive amasec, and the knowledge that however bad things get, they'd be a whole lot worse if we weren't doing what we do. Humanity's survival rides on our backs every time we step into the void. No pressure, right? So, if you're hoping for a tale of noble heroism and glamorous void-faring adventure, I'm sorry to disappoint. This isn't that kind of story. How does one become a navigator, you ask? The short answer is, you don't. You're born as one, whether you like it or not. The navigator gene isn't something you can pick up at your local administratum office. It's a quirk of blood and magic, a mutation carefully cultivated through millennia in a few select bloodlines. In my case, it goes back so many generations that our family archives claim we were guiding ships before the Imperium even existed. Perhaps that's an exaggeration, perhaps not. Navigators love to embellish our pedigrees. But suffice it to say, I didn't have a normal childhood. I was born into one of the Navi's Nobilites' noble houses on Terra. Yes, that Terra, holy Terra, birthplace of mankind and all that. Though don't imagine I grew up playing in the shadow of the Imperial Palace or anything so grand. The navigators have their own quarter of the planet, a walled-off enclave of mansions and spires where the light of the Astronomican filters through stained glass and everything smells faintly of incense and gene treatments. In the estate of my house behind gates emblazoned with our three-eyed crest, I spent my early years in a world at once luxurious and strangely claustrophobic. My earliest memories are a blur of opulence and oddity. Marble hallways lined with ancient star charts and portraits of pallid ancestors with elongated features and jeweled blindfolds over their foreheads. Tutors whispering endless lessons about warp currents, imperial astrography, and the illustrious history of our lineage. Servants who moved silently and avoided my gaze. I later learned it was out of superstitious fear that catching the slightest glimpse of a navigator's warp eye might doom them. As a child, I didn't fully understand why the staff would never look me in the eyes, or rather, the eye, why some flinched if I got too close. I knew I was different. The small mirror in my nursery made that clear enough when I dared peek under the silk band they made me wear on my brow. But I hadn't yet grasped what being different truly meant. I remember once when I was perhaps 5 or 6, sneaking away from my minders to play in the gardens. There was a new groundskeeper's boy, my age, chasing flutterflies among the phosphor lamps. Curious, I cornered him under a statue of the Emperor, a smaller copy of the one in the palace, I think, and proudly lifted my fringe to show him the tiny closed eyelid nestled above my brows. I expected him to be impressed, or at least curious. Instead, the poor boy went white as a sheet and started screaming bloody murder. He screamed as if I were a horror from a nightmare, which, in a sense, I suppose I was. The nurses came running, hustled the boy away, and scolded me severely. That was the day I began to understand that my third eye, barely open and certainly not doing anything at the time, made me something frightening to others. I didn't show anyone my forehead without the band again after that, not unless I had to, not if I wanted a friend. Loneliness is something of a theme in a navigator's upbringing. Oh, I had siblings, a few in fact, since navigator families tend to produce multiple heirs to ensure the bloodline continues. But our interactions were peculiar. We loved each other, I suppose, in our own way, but we all knew even as children that we each carried a tremendous weight on our shoulders. We were groomed for a destiny that none of us could escape. One by one, we'd leave the safety of those mansion walls to brave the void. At least one of us was expected to distinguish themselves, perhaps even become novator, the head of the house one day. We were acutely aware that the future of the house depended on us producing the next generation of navigators too, which is a fancy way of saying we'd eventually be paired off in arranged marriages like prize cattle at market. As a child, I didn't worry much about marriage. That horror came later. But I did worry about living up to the family name. From the moment I could read star charts and calculate a translation vector, which was about when other kids might be learning their ABCs, I was inundated with instruction. My days were a regimented schedule of study and practice, mornings spent with ancient astrocartographers memorizing the positions of distant nebulae and the known safe warp routes between them, afternoons in dusty libraries poring over tomes of Emperor knows what arcana about the warp's nature, half of it metaphor and allegory, to be honest. How do you describe the indescribable? I learned of the Astronomican, the Emperor's great psychic beacon on Terra, and how it would be my guiding star in the Immaterium. I learned the litany every navigator recites before opening their third eye, a sort of prayer and focus mantra combined, meant to steel the mind against what might come. I learned basic meditation techniques to calm the soul and clamp down on fear, crucial skills, though I'd find out they only go so far when you're actually out there in the thick of it. But book learning and simulated exercises can only take you so far. The true education of a navigator begins when you first set foot on a void ship and experience a warp translation with your own senses. That day came when I was still fairly young, perhaps barely into my teens. I was taken aboard our house's own merchant vessel, a gilded bark used for carrying family envoys and cargo between Terra and nearby systems. My father, a veteran navigator himself, was at the helm, and I was to be an observer, nothing more. Watch, listen, and do not open your eye unless I tell you, he warned me sternly. I nodded, nervous and excited all at once. I'll never forget that first jump. The moment we left real space, I could feel it, a lurch in my gut as reality sort of fell away. The Gellar Field hummed to life, its protective energies cocooning the ship and all of us within, in a thin shell of reality to keep the warp's nastiness out. I knew the theory of it, of course, but feeling it was another matter. It's a bit like the pressure change when diving underwater. Your ears pop, your skin prickles. Only instead of water outside, it's something far more alien pressing against every surface, trying to get in. My father stood on the navigator's dais, a raised platform on the bridge encircled by dull brass railings. I was strapped into a seat just below him, clinging to the armrests with sweaty palms. Around us, the bridge crew murmured nervous prayers. They always do that when it's time to enter the warp, even if they've done it 100 times, the superstitious lot. Not that I blame them, they can't see what's out there like we do, but they feel the dread all the same. A couple of ratings made the sign of the Aquila across their chests as the ship's hull groaned from warp turbulence. I could smell incense. The engineers must have been appeasing the machine spirits in the engine room. "Steady," my father said, mostly to himself. He had his eyes closed, his two normal eyes, that is, and I knew behind the ornate golden band he wore, his warp eye was opening. I couldn't see it. Thank the Emperor. I wasn't ready to behold even his third eye directly then, but I sensed a change in the air, like a charge of static electricity. The bridge got quieter. Even the servitors stopped their clattering for a moment as if in awe or fear. Father's breathing slowed. I dared not blink, watching him intently while also desperately trying to remember my meditation techniques so I wouldn't panic. "Look," he whispered to me. His voice had taken on that distant tone it always did when he was in the trance of navigation. "Slowly now. Open yourself to it. Just a crack." I hesitated, every muscle tensing. This was it, the moment all those years of study had led to. I swallowed the lump in my throat, loosened the silk band covering my own nascent third eye, and closed my mundane eyes. Gently, like gingerly opening a door to see if a monster lurked behind it, I willed my warp eye to see. At first, I perceived nothing but darkness. I thought maybe I'd done it wrong. Then the darkness began to move. Swirls of color like oil on water seeped in at the edges of my awareness. I felt a pressure against my mind, a kind of psychic wind howling at that little door I'd cracked open. Instinctively, I wanted to slam it shut and bolt it forever. But I could sense my father's presence, a calm beacon beside me, his consciousness touching mine in the Immaterium like a reassuring hand on the shoulder. So I held the door open just a tiny bit more. Suddenly, the emptiness blossomed into a riot of sensation. I saw the warp, not with eyes, not in any way I had truly seen before, but my brain struggled to interpret it. Initially, it cloaked itself in metaphor. I found myself picturing a vast ocean of black water, shot through with bioluminescent colors, as if the stars themselves had dissolved into glowing plankton drifting in a bottomless sea. It was beautiful for a heartbeat, awe-inspiring even. But then the true nature of it started pressing through the cracks of that comforting illusion. Those lights in the deep, they weren't stars at all, they were eyes staring back at me. And the ocean wasn't water, it was something viscous and alive, and it was aware of my tiny presence bobbing on its surface. I sensed things moving in the currents, huge leviathan shapes coiling and uncoiling far below, leaving wakes of rippling unreality. I must have whimpered or made some sound of fright because I felt my father's mental grip tighten around mine. "Focus on the light of Terra," I heard his voice echo inside my head. Or maybe it was just memory reminding me of my training. Yes, the Astronomican. I was supposed to look for the guiding light of the Emperor. Frantically, I cast my inner sight about, trying to find a lighthouse in that nightmare sea. It wasn't like seeing a single beam or anything so literal. It was more an instinct, a pull in a certain direction, like feeling the warmth of a sun on your face with your eyes closed and knowing roughly where it lies. Through the swirling insanity, I caught the faintest glimmer of something pure and golden far, far away. The Astronomican. It was as if on the horizon of my mind's eye, a thin ray of dawn peeked through an endless night. I focused on that ray with all my will, clinging to it as a lifeline. The fear ebbed slightly, the cacophony of the warp dulled in the presence of the Emperor's light. I breathed again. "Good, good," I heard Father say softly. He sounded both proud and relieved. My other senses slowly came back into balance. I became aware of my heart hammering in my chest, sweat trickling down my neck. I don't know how long I had my third eye open. Probably only a few seconds in real time, though it had felt like hours to me. When I finally closed that inner eye, I sagged back into the seat, trembling. I realized I had bitten my lip. I tasted blood. My father looked down at me and gave the barest hint of a smile, a rare display from a man usually so stern. "Your maiden voyage," he said quietly so that only I could hear. "And you did well. Rest now. Just watch me." I nodded weakly. I was both exhausted and exhilarated, the adrenaline of terror still coursing through me. I watched as he returned his full attention to the warp, guiding the ship along whatever safe corridor he had chosen. I didn't dare open myself up like that again on that trip. Once was plenty for one day. Instead, I observed, trying to glean something from how his body reacted, the subtle gestures of his hands, as if he were actually steering a wheel. Old habits. Some navigators move their hands as if piloting a boat, visualizing they're literally charting a course over physical waves. It lasted maybe a few more hours. We made a short hop from Terra to the edge of the solar system, a minor jaunt by navigator standards, but to me it was monumental. When we slipped back into real space and the warp finally released its grip on our vessel, I remember letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The crew visibly relaxed as well, bridge officers exchanging relieved nods, the tension in the air dissipating as normal reality reasserted itself. Later, back in my quarters aboard ship, I fell onto my cot and slept for a solid 18 hours. Dreamlessly, thank the throne. Had I dreamed, I suspect it would have been of that dark ocean and those eyes in the deep. As initiation experiences go, it was intense but successful. I had faced the warp's edge and not been broken by it. But I also learned just how right all the warnings were. It was horrifying, even with a guiding hand and minimal exposure. And that was the shallow end of the warp, comparatively speaking. I knew that out there, beyond the controlled, well-charted routes of the solar vicinity, lay far worse. The thought should have scared me off then and there, made me run back home and beg to hide in the family estate forever. Perhaps it nearly did. But there was also a spark of something else in me after that first taste, a strange mixture of curiosity, duty, and yes, a touch of pride. I had glimpsed the nightmare and lived. Part of me, a small, crazy part, wanted to see if I could do it again, go further, see more. Foolish, maybe, but it's what our house trained us for. They say the navigator gene carries with it a pinch of wanderlust or hubris, depending who you ask. Maybe they're right. Of course, not all of my training voyages went as smoothly as that first one. There were mishaps, close calls that nearly sent me gibbering to the medikey. Once, during a training jump in a relatively calm segment of the warp, I got cocky and opened my third eye wider than I should have. I wanted to impress Father with my confidence. Instead, I caught a glimpse, just the briefest glimpse, of something staring back at me from the void. It was like a silhouette of a giant predatory fish, but composed of swirling ash and embers. It had no features I could describe except a maw full of jagged light. I gasped, and in that moment of lost focus, the creature, or the hallucination of one, who can say in that realm, lunged at our ship's bubble of reality. The whole vessel shuddered. I heard later that alarms flared across the lower decks, crewmen crying out as if some unseen force had brushed past their souls. My father snapped my mind back to focus with a psychic shout, the mental equivalent of a slap. I recoiled, shutting my inner eye completely. He narrowly veered us off whatever turbulence that thing had caused. When we emerged, Father was furious. I was shaking like a leaf. He didn't even need to scold me. The lesson was burned into my mind. Never, ever lose focus in the warp. Overconfidence can kill, or worse. Yes, there are worse things than death out there. There are fates that make mortal death seem a mercy, but I wouldn't truly understand the depths of those horrors until much later. As a young apprentice, I learned enough to respect the warp deeply and fear it appropriately, and I learned to obey the cardinal rule of every navigator. Trust the Emperor's light and keep your damned eyes on the path. My formative years flew by in a series of warp transits, training sessions, and indoctrinations into the mysteries of my house. By the time I came of age, around 20 standard years old, I was considered ready for assignment. In truth, I felt barely prepared. But one doesn't argue when the elders say it's time. There were contracts to fulfill, ships waiting for a warp guide, and not enough seasoned navigators to go around. Fresh blood is always in demand. After all, many of us either retire due to medical complications or are lost to the void by that age. Here, I should mention something about those complications. The navigator gene, marvelous as it is, comes with certain side effects. You've probably heard tales of our kind being hideously mutated, and well, some of those tales aren't far off. The same gift that lets us touch the warp without immediate obliteration also warps us slowly over our lifetimes. Maybe it's the inbreeding we try to keep bloodlines pure, which historically leads to some interesting genetic oddities. Or maybe it's prolonged exposure to the Immaterium's energies, or likely a bit of both. The older a navigator gets, typically the more unique they look. I've been fortunate. In my youth, I could almost pass for an ordinary human if I covered my third eye and dressed down my more eccentric fashion tendencies. But I had uncles and aunts who could not pass so easily. One great-uncle of mine had skin so thin and pale you could see blue veins webbing his face like a road map, and his eyes, the normal two, had turned completely black by the age of 60. A distant cousin was covered in fine iridescent scales, which she rather fancied and called the Emperor's gift, though I'm pretty sure the Emperor had little to do with giving her reptilian skin. And then there was my grandfather. By the time I knew him, he was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, his spine twisted and hunched, requiring a suspensor chair to move around. He'd grown an extra knuckle on each finger, making his hands look more like claws. I loved that old man dearly. He used to bounce me on his knee, carefully, and recount his harrowing voyages in a deep baritone voice. But to an outsider, he must have looked like a monster from a fever dream. When he passed away, they sealed his body in a lead-lined casket. Rumor was that his third eye had started emitting light even when closed, and they feared it might open unexpectedly at his death. True or not, it scared me to think that might be my fate someday. We navigators don't often speak of these things with outsiders, but we joke about them amongst ourselves with morbid humor. Seen any new scales today? A navigator might quip to another on a long voyage, or careful, or you'll end up like old Paris, growing gills and breathing void. It's a coping mechanism. You have to laugh sometimes at the absurdity of it. If you don't, the despair might consume you, because in the back of every navigator's mind lies the knowledge. We are needed and privileged, yes, but we are also mutants living on borrowed time. The Imperium tolerates us only as long as we're useful. There are plenty of zealots out there who'd love to burn us at the stake if given half a chance. Never mind that their entire civilization would collapse without us. In those days before I left Terra for my first independent commission, I was given the customary send-off by my house. It was a formal affair in our grand dining hall. Long tables, silk banners bearing our coat of arms, an eye wreathed in stars, lots of toasts with ancient amasec that burned like fire going down. My mother, a formidable woman who managed our house's affairs but never traveled herself due to frail health, gave a speech reminding me of my duty to uphold the family reputation. I recall she said something like, "Wherever you go, you carry all of us with you in spirit. Our honor travels with you." No pressure, Mother. My father wasn't there to see me off. He had vanished a year earlier, lost along with the ship he was guiding through a warp route near the Maelstrom Zone. One day we received astropathic notice that his ship had gone missing in the Immaterium. It never re-emerged. No trace ever found. It hit me hard. He had been my mentor as well as my parent. I wasn't fully over it when I took my leave, and truth be told, a part of me was terrified. If such a seasoned navigator as him could be snuffed out just like that, what chance did I have? But I never voiced that fear. Instead, I left our estate with my head held high, determined to make my own mark. I was assigned to an Imperial Navy vessel as my first post, the Void Caller, an aging but sturdy frigate tasked with patrolling trade routes and occasionally ferrying important diplomats or supplies. She wasn't a particularly famous ship, just one of countless workhorses keeping the machinery of the Imperium running. But to me, she was a world of new experiences. I still remember stepping aboard for the first time, the echoing clang of my boots on the metal deck, the smell of machine oil and incense intermingling in the air, the distant thrum of the plasma reactors resonating through the hull. The crew eyed me with the usual mixture of reverence and unease reserved for navigators. I was Lord Navigator to them, even though I was barely 20 and felt like a fraud wearing the fine blue void suit of my office. They gave me wide berth in the corridors, whispered behind my back. I pretended not to notice. At first, I stayed mostly in my designated chambers. Navigators on Navy ships are given their own sanctum near the bridge, often high up in a spire or dome, so that our perception isn't obstructed by too much hull when we peer out into the warp. My sanctum on the Void Caller was modest, a circular room with a domed ceiling that could open mechanically to a transparent steel view of the stars, though when in warp, that dome would be sealed and display only shifting nothingness. There was an ornate throne-like chair interfaced with the ship's systems, where I'd sit during translations. Skitarii guards stood watch at the entrance when I was at work, partially to ensure I wasn't disturbed, and partially to ensure I didn't, say, wander out at an inopportune moment with my warp eye uncovered and accidentally fry a bunch of people. Yes, that has happened before. Navigators have caused some tragic incidents on ships when they got careless. I was not planning to be one of those cautionary tales. Under the mentorship of an older navigator assigned to the same ship, a grizzled woman named Portia, who had a withered face but a sharp mind, I spent my early voyages on the Void Caller, learning the ropes of solo duty. Portia was officially near retirement, but she stayed on just long enough to oversee my transition. She showed me the quirks of the ship's warp engines, the temperament of its machine spirit. Every ship has a personality, and some are more cooperative with the navigator than others. Void Caller, fortunately, was steady and predictable. The Mechanicus priest in charge of her engines was competent and even friendly enough, insofar as tech priests can be friendly. He mostly just didn't spit at the mention of mutant, which by their standards was warmth. My first independent warp jump as sole navigator in charge was from Terra to a naval base at Barnard's Star, a routine 6-day hop through stable warp lanes. By stable, I mean only mildly terrifying. I followed the usual precautions, performed my divinations, in my case, a simple reading of the Emperor's Tarot. I never had much talent for the more esoteric stuff like scrying bones or reading animal entrails. I liked the familiarity of the Tarot's imagery to focus my mind. The cards hinted at turbulence ahead, but nothing dire. Portia observed quietly from the corner of the chamber to grade my performance. I gave the command to translate. The Void Caller slipped into the Sea of Souls, and for the first time I felt wholly responsible as that alien pressure encircled us. It was like standing on a stage with a hostile audience, waiting to see if you'd slip up. I sat in the Navigator's throne, interfaced with the ship's sensors and psychically with its guidance spirit. I opened my third eye. Not too wide, just enough. The warp flooded my vision. There was the Astronomican, bright as ever in my mind's sky. I steered us toward it, charting a course like threading a needle through moving ghostly currents. All went well for the first day or two. I grew more confident, maybe even a tad overconfident, thinking, this isn't so bad. The warp has a way of punishing such thoughts. On the third day, we hit a snag, a minor warp squall that hadn't shown up on any charts or in my divinations. Imagine sailing on calm waters and suddenly a fog and thunderstorm roll in out of nowhere. The ship rocked. In my chamber, I felt turbulence rattling at our Gellar Field. For a second, just a microsecond, I thought I heard whispers in my mind that didn't belong to me. A sign that something outside was testing our defenses, perhaps. My heart pounded. I reacted quickly, adjusting our course and concentrating to reinforce the Gellar Field in our vicinity, an old trick Portia had taught. How a navigator can synergize with the field by will, since our warp-attuned nature can sometimes bolster the bubble, or so we believe. The whispers faded, the storm passed. We arrived only a day late and none the wiser among the crew. Officially, it was a smooth trip. Unofficially, I had to excuse myself to my quarters for an hour afterward to calm my shaking hands and to check that I hadn't suddenly sprouted an extra finger in the ordeal. I hadn't. Not that time. Portia gave me a tight-lipped nod of approval when it was done. You kept your head. That's key, she said. Many don't. Their first time alone in the big chair. Hearing that felt as good as any medal. Then she added, don't let it go to your head either. The moment you think you've got the warp tamed, it'll show you otherwise, boy. Sage advice, which I've kept close ever since. After that, I was on my own. Portia disembarked at the naval base, off to enjoy a well-deserved retirement, or as much retirement as a navigator ever gets. She was actually heading back to Terra to become an instructor for youths, trading one kind of stress for another. I, on the other hand, remained with the Void Caller, now the sole navigator aboard. I was proud, I was nervous, and above all, I was determined to do my job well. For the Emperor, for my house, and frankly, for my own survival. The next few years on the Void Caller saw me slowly transform from a green apprentice to a seasoned voidfarer. We plied the space lanes of Segmentum Solar and beyond, mostly safe routes with the occasional detour into risky areas when orders demanded. I got to know some of the crew as much as they allowed. Most were still afraid to get too chummy. The captain, an aging Navy man with a bionic arm, treated me with professional respect and was wise enough to heed my warnings when I gave them. On one occasion, I recall, an administratum envoy pressed him to push through a known warp turbulence region to shave a day off our journey to Hydrafer. I protested, saying that was a fool's route at that time, based on what I had sensed in my pre-voyage meditation. The envoy was insistent, a real pompous fool, until the captain quietly asked him whether he'd like to personally take over, navigating the ship in my stead. That shut him up. We took a safer, if slightly longer, route. Sure enough, we later heard that another merchant vessel that left around the same time and dared the shortcut never made it out of the warp. I remember the captain giving me a knowing nod after that news. From then on, he always backed my play when it came to matters of the warp. By and large, though, life settled into a routine. There's a lot of downtime on voyages when translating through the warp. Contrary to what people might think, I don't spend every single moment of a multi-day jump with my eye open, actively steering. If the course is straightforward and the warp relatively calm, a navigator can relax a little, remain in a light trance, and only occasionally adjust the heading. In those moments, I'd almost meditate, or sometimes daydream, with both my normal eyes closed and my third eye just barely ajar to keep a feel for things. I'd let my mind wander to memories of home or idle fantasies of what I'd do if I weren't cooped up in a golden chair in a dark chamber, breathing recycled air. Inevitably, my thoughts during those quiet stretches would circle back to why I was here. I thought of my father often, especially when I was alone in the warp, the light of the Astronomican pulsing in my mind like a heartbeat. Was he out there somewhere, I wondered, lost in the sea of souls or devoured by it? Would I know if something had happened to his soul? Some navigators claim they feel a disturbance when a kinsman dies in warp, as if a distant star winked out. I never felt anything like that. For all I knew, he was simply gone to oblivion. Warp travel doesn't leave many ghosts to retrieve. I also thought of the bigger picture, the Imperium, the endless war that raged while we quietly did our part, ferrying people and supplies. We navigators are somewhat removed from the common fray of humanity. We're not soldiers, though war affects us. We're not governors or workers or priests. We're a breed apart, literally and figuratively, but we keep the lines of the great human empire connected. Without us, every system would be isolated. Humanity would fragment, probably perish. It's a heavy thing to contemplate at 0300 ship time, alone with your bizarre thoughts, peering into a kaleidoscope of unreality. Sometimes I'd chuckle at the absurdity. Here we were, aboard this metal behemoth with tens of thousands of crew, all their hopes pinned on me doing math and magic at the front of the bus to make sure we didn't all die horribly. What a strange life, and how little most of those ordinary souls knew about what I really did. To them, I was a weird noble with a mutation, locked away in my tower. They likely imagined I sat on a pile of gold whispering spells, or communing with the Emperor directly. If only they knew I was just as scared as they were, sometimes more. It wasn't all drudgery and fear, mind you. There were moments of wonder, even humor out there. I saw nebulae through the viewport that glowed in colors I lack words for. I once guided us through the aftermath of a supernova, and the sight of the newborn pulsar casting beams across the void nearly moved me to tears. Of course, the radiation nearly fried our auger arrays, but that's another matter. There was also the time our astropath, the psyker who sends messages, got drunk on sacramental wine and stumbled into my navigator chamber mid-transit, babbling about the Emperor's angels. He shouldn't have been there, a grave breach of protocol, but he was too out of his wits to know. I had my eye open at low intensity. The poor fool looked right at me and collapsed, foaming at the mouth. We had to haul him out, and he couldn't form a coherent sentence for a week. I felt bad for him and made sure he recovered, but it took all my restraint not to laugh at the absurdity. He later told me he thought he'd glimpsed the face of the god Emperor in my eye. I didn't have the heart to tell him that actually he'd probably just gotten a near-lethal dose of warp exposure from staring at me, and whatever he saw was certainly not the Emperor. But hey, If it strengthened his faith and kept him functional, good for him. Those early voyages built up my confidence and my tolerance for the warp's peculiar brand of stress. Bit by bit, I became one of those cool, inscrutable navigators I used to look up to, on the outside at least. I learned to keep a mask of calm on my face, even when my blood ran cold. If crew members saw me walking the halls between transits, they saw a composed young noble in a high-collared void suit, perhaps a little too pale and with eyes a little too black, but otherwise dignified. They didn't see the nights I spent gripping my bedroll, dreaming of teeth in the dark. They didn't hear me whisper prayers to the Emperor in the privacy of my chamber when the warp storms howled. Navigators must project confidence. It's part of the unwritten code. Because if we show fear, everyone will fear. And if morale breaks on a warp journey, then the real predators smell blood in the water. Little did I know, however, that my true trial by fire, or by warp, rather, was yet to come. Up until then, I'd had brushes with danger, yes, but nothing that truly crossed the line into nightmare. That was about to change, on a voyage I recall now with a mix of dread and grim amusement at my own hubris. It was the mission that would show me just how small and fragile our ship and my sanity really were in the grand scheme of the Immaterium. And it all started, as many misadventures do, with a great idea from high command that things would be just fine so long as we stuck to the plan. Plans, ha. The warp and plans have never been on friendly terms. Let me tell you about the time the Void Caller and her bright-eyed navigator, yours truly, took a detour straight into Hell's own backyard. We received the assignment at Port Wander, a busy naval station near the outskirts of Segmentum Solar. It was a bright day, or as bright as it gets in the void, with the station's lumens simulating a cheerful noon. I had been lounging in the officers' mess, sipping recaf and exchanging trivial banter with a junior lieutenant, who was visibly uncomfortable in my presence but too polite to flee. That's when the summons came. New orders, top priority. The Void Caller was to depart immediately on a mission to the Gothic sector, several sectors away, carrying vital personnel and intelligence. The catch? We were to make all haste, cutting what corners we could in warp travel to arrive as close to yesterday as possible. In other words, High Command wanted a minor miracle from me. I perused the star charts and warp route data as the ship ready to depart. A direct route to our destination would skirt the edges of the Maelstrom, a notoriously unstable warp region, a permanent storm of Immaterium where the fabric of reality is thin. Normally, navigators give such regions wide berth unless they fancy becoming one with the Chaos Gods. But the alternative was a much longer arc around, adding precious weeks. The Admiralty had made it plain, speed was essential. Word was that a major conflict was brewing, something about a chaos warband inciting rebellion on an Imperial world. They needed reinforcement and the intel we carried, and they needed it fast. So the captain and I consulted, and with some reluctance we agreed to plot a course closer to the Maelstrom than we'd ever dared before, trusting my skill to keep us safe. Privately, I had misgivings. Any navigator with half a brain does when asked to sail near a warp storm's shoals. I spent extra time in preparation, conducting not one but 3 separate divination rituals. The Emperor's tarot turned up unsettling cards. The tower, disaster. The demon, no kidding. And the lantern, which I hoped was the Astronomican guiding us. It was an ominous spread, but not an absolute no-go in my interpretation. Perhaps in my zeal to prove myself, I took it as a challenge rather than a warning. Dryly, I remember thinking, well, at least it wasn't the warp spawn card. In hindsight, any warning is enough, but we often see what we want to see. We entered the warp shortly after leaving Port Wander, translating smoothly into that familiar nightmare sea. At first, all was routine. I charted a swift course, feeling the Void Caller's spirit respond eagerly, as if the old girl knew we were on an important run. The crew was tense but confident. By now, they had faith in their navigator not to lead them astray. The first couple of days in warp passed without incident. I noted some heightened turbulence as we gradually angled closer to the maelstrom's outskirts, but it was within expected parameters. I even recall eating a proper meal at one point, a rarity for me mid-transit, because things seemed stable enough to allow a brief respite from the trance. Looking back, that was the calm before the storm, literally and figuratively. On the third day of translation, all hell broke loose. I was in the navigator's throne, eye open and focused, when I felt it. A ripple of wrongness in the Immaterium ahead of us. The warp currents that had been flowing relatively predictably suddenly shifted, like a tide changing direction in an instant. One moment, the path was clear. The next, it was as if a great chasm opened up in the sea before us, sucking everything toward it. The Void Caller lurched violently. In real space terms, imagine hitting a massive unseen whirlpool. The Gellar Field generators chimed alerts as the strain on our protective bubble spiked. I snapped fully alert, all thoughts of rest gone. Peering ahead with my third eye, I saw what was coming. A warp storm, small perhaps by the maelstrom's standards, but directly in our trajectory and kicking up Immaterium like a dust storm in a tomb. Multicolored lightning forked through the warp ahead, rippling through clouds of raw emotion turned tangible. We were sailing into a tempest of unreality. I shouted through the Vox link for the helmsman to prepare for evasive maneuvers. Even though in warp, physical helm control is secondary to my guidance, the ship still has thrusters to help. The captain's voice came through. "Navigator, what's happening?" I barely managed to respond, something like, "Sudden turbulence. Hold on." All my concentration was bent on steering us out of the worst of it. I altered course to ride the edge of the storm rather than be swallowed by it. For a short while, it seemed like we might skirt the worst. The Void Caller groaned and shuddered, but stayed intact, our Gellar Field flickering but holding. I could hear the distant clanging of warning bells throughout the ship. The crew would be rushing to battle stations, thinking perhaps we'd encountered an enemy fleet. If only it were something so mundane. As I guided us along the periphery of the warp squall, new problems arose. The Astronomican, my guiding beacon, started to fade in and out like a guttering candle. The storm's psychic resonance was interfering with the Emperor's light. At times I glimpsed it, at times I was effectively blind. This is the nightmare of any navigator, being caught in the dark in the warp. I fought down panic and focused on memory, on intuition. I knew roughly the route and the direction of Terra's beacon. I could still sense it faintly, like feeling warmth through a thick wall. "Just keep us steady. Get clear of this," I whispered to myself. Without the constant reference of the Astronomican, though, other voices grew more noticeable. Normally, the Emperor's presence is a bulwark in my mind against the whispers of the warp. Now, those whispers crept in. I heard skittering laughter at the edge of my consciousness, a gibbering chorus that rose and fell with the storm's gusts. Shapes formed in the swirling madness beyond our Gellar bubble. I saw them as flickers of darkness, maybe real, maybe hallucination. One moment, a horde of slithering things flanking us like sharks trailing a ship. Another, they vanished. At some point, the ship's alarms took on a new tone, a wailing I had never wanted to hear, the breach alarm. My stomach dropped. That meant only one thing. The Gellar Field had fluctuated badly, or part of it had faltered, and something got in. A chorus of distant screams from the lower decks confirmed it. A heartbeat later, echoing through the metal corridors. "Emperor, preserve us," I breathed. But I had no time to help them. My duty was singular: keep navigating, get us out of the storm, or we all perish. Still, over the comm, I heard the bosun shouting about something. Intrusion on decks 5 and 6. I forced myself to shut it out. Cold sweat dripped down my brow. "Focus!" The storm pounded us relentlessly. With each psychic thunderclap, the lights in my chamber flickered. At one point, they died entirely, leaving me illuminated only by the eerie glow of the navigational holo-displays and a faint, sickly luminescence filtering in from the dome overhead, an aurora of warp energy dancing on our void shields. In the moment of darkness, I felt a presence behind me. I wasn't alone in the chamber. Slowly, I turned my head, keeping my warp eye oriented forward, still gazing into that nightmare trying to hold our course. With my peripheral vision, I saw the heavy bulkhead door to my sanctum had somehow melted open. It was distorted, as if reality had lost cohesion around it. Standing just inside the threshold was a figure. At first, I thought it was one of the armsmen, someone come to check on me or guard me. A human silhouette, shrouded in shadow from the malfunctioning lights. I could make out a uniform. My racing heart eased slightly. Someone had come to help, perhaps. Then the silhouette stepped forward into a flicker of erratic light, and I realized how terribly mistaken I was. It was wearing the skin of one of our crewmen, yes, a young officer by the looks of the tattered remains of a Navy uniform hanging off its frame. But the way it moved was all wrong, jerky, like a puppet suspended on quivering strings. And the eyes. Emperor, those eyes. They glowed with a lambent red hunger in the gloom. I knew then that a demon, minor but deadly nonetheless, had forced its way through the weakening Gellar Field and possessed this poor soul, warping flesh and bone as it pleased. The thing's mouth lolled open, jaw distending wider than any human jaw should, a slavering grin that split its cheeks. It spoke without moving its lips, a voice that echoed both in the air and in my head. "Little navigator." It dragged out the syllables, mockingly. "You look lost." I could feel its words crawling inside my skull like maggots of doubt and fear. For a fraction of a second, my concentration wavered. The course I was holding began to slip. The void collar yawed sharply, sending a tremor through the deck. "No, not now. Focus," I hissed to myself, blinking sweat out of my eyes. Through my third eye, I saw a new hazard ahead. The storm had spawned jagged reefs of rampant warp energy, like shards of broken glass floating in our path. We needed to drop out of warp or change vector drastically now, or we'd be shredded. But I had this uninvited guest to deal with. The possessed officer took another ungainly step toward me. In one clawed hand, his fingers had elongated into talons, he clutched a blood-stained hunk of metal. I recognized it as a fragment of a bulkhead door, likely torn straight off, inhumanly. It took another step. With a sudden, violent motion, it hurled the metal shard across the chamber. It slammed into the cogitator bank to my left, sending sparks showering. The machine spirit of the guidance system sputtered. I felt a jolt of pain behind my eyes as part of my connection to the ship flickered. "Why do you struggle so?" the demon cooed with perverse sweetness from the man's mouth. "All your life in darkness and fear. Come, let go. It would be so easy." I realized with a chill that its goal was not just to kill me. It wanted me to lose focus, to slip, to misnavigate. In the warp, that is a fate worse than any quick death. If I faltered, in seconds we could veer off into unrecoverable insanity or be swallowed whole by the storm. Everyone on board would be doomed to an eternity of torment, bodies and souls torn apart, or worse. I could not let that happen. Yet, here I was, strapped into the navigator's chair. We strap in to avoid being thrown during turbulence, and effectively a sitting target for the intruder. My hand crept toward the release latch of the harness, slowly, quietly. Meanwhile, I mustered my voice, trying to project calm authority, though my insides were churning. "You're a fool if you think I'll bend," I managed, with only a slight quaver. "This ship is under the Emperor's protection. Begone, fiend, or I'll send you screaming back to the abyss." Not the wittiest or most original banter, I admit, but it was mostly to buy time and steel my own nerves. The thing found it amusing. It giggled with that stolen voice, a horribly incongruent sound, like a child's laugh echoed in a tomb. "Emperor," it spat, and suddenly the officer's face, what was left of it, twisted in rage. "That carrion lord cannot help you here. No one can." Its eyes flicked upward to my forehead, where beneath a thin circlet my warp eye was undoubtedly glowing. "Ah, shall we peek, little one?" it hissed. "Show me yours, and I'll show you mine." It was advancing again, crouched like a predator ready to spring. My fingers found the harness latch. In one motion, I unlocked it and threw myself sideways out of the throne. Just in time, the possessed officer lunged with a feral snarl, swiping those metal talons through the space I'd just occupied. Had I been a hair slower, I'd have been gutted. I hit the floor hard, but adrenaline numbed the pain. Now we faced each other in the flickering half-light of my chamber. Me crouched, one hand instinctively going to the band across my forehead, the demon thing standing between me and the only exit. My heart thundered. I knew I had perhaps seconds to end this, one way or another. In the back of my mind, I also felt the ship drifting off course further. Without my guidance at the helm, we were essentially flying blind through a warp storm. Not sustainable at all. The thought of thousands of lives hanging on what I did in the next few moments focused my resolve like never before. There are few weapons a navigator has against a warp entity. We're not trained exorcists or Grey Knights or anything of the sort. But we do have one advantage: our cursed eye. The very thing that horrifies normal humans can be pure anathema to a creature of the Immaterium. The trouble is, using it in such a way is incredibly dangerous. Staring directly at a demon with the warp eye unleashes what's called the lidless stare, a concentrated blast of the warp's own energy. It's like opening a high-pressure vent. Whatever is in the direct line of sight is usually obliterated, mind and soul. The few beings tough enough to survive even a second of it are left gibbering wrecks. There's mention in our texts of someone surviving a momentary glimpse, a powerful sorcerer, if I recall, who went half-mad afterward and described the sensation as the sea of warp, distant yet all-encompassing, bubbled to the surface of reality to swallow me. Nearly everyone else, mortal or demon, is destroyed outright. We can also modulate it, tone it down to stun or scare, but that requires fine control and typically years of practice in duels. In a life-or-death moment, you don't get fancy. You blast full force and hope for the best. Doing this inside a space full of innocent people is a terrible idea. It would kill them, too. And even doing it alone can backfire. It can fry the navigator's mind or leave permanent scars spiritually. I'd never actually employed the lidless stare in full force before. It's taught to us in theory, with stern warnings. Break glass only in case of a worst-case scenario, essentially. This was as worst-case as it got. So I made the call. The demon must have sensed my intent because it let out a shriek, whether of excitement or fear, I'm not sure. It barreled towards me, likely hoping to stop me before I could act. But I was already pulling the silk band up from my third eye. Time seemed to slow. I felt the eyelid, that strange alien lid that I normally keep closed, except when navigating, slide open. Cold air touched the naked orb. It stung, or maybe that was the warp energy crackling around us. "Witness the Emperor's light, abomination," I spat, twisting my head to face it dead on. And then I looked. I don't know how to adequately describe what happens from my perspective when I unleash the warp eye fully. It's not like looking from my normal eyes. It's like I become the gaze, become a conduit. My vision, physical and psychic, filled with a blinding white and violet glare. There was a pressure, a wrenching feeling as reality bent. A sound like all the air being sucked out of a room, followed by a whoosh of roaring wind that might have been purely inside my head. I saw the demon, not just the possessed flesh, but its true shape protruding from the man like a grotesque shadow. It was tall, spindly, with too many jointed limbs and a face that was all teeth and nails. For a microsecond, its red eyes widened in surprise and, pleasingly, terror. Then the tidal wave of warp energy that poured from my gaze hit it full force. What happened to the possessed man was mercifully quick. One heartbeat, he was there. The next, he was gone, vaporized into a fine black ash from head to toe. The creature inside was exposed, a silhouette of darkness thrashing in the onslaught of light I unleashed. It howled, a noise that will haunt me, half rage, half agony. One clawed limb reached toward me as if to grab or curse me in its death throes, but it never got the chance. With a final shuddering scream that echoed in octaves no human ear should hear, the demon was ripped apart, dissolved into motes of sickly brilliance, and then nothingness. Banished back to the warp from whence it came. All that remained was a charred outline on the floor plating where the officer had stood, and a lingering smell of ozone and burnt soul. If that has a smell, I swear it does. I sagged, slumping against the dais of the throne for support. My head felt like it had been split with an axe. Blood trickled from my nose. I wiped it, and my hand came away slick and dark. My vision through my normal eyes was spotty. I quickly covered my warp eye again. No need to add accidental collateral damage now. That brief flare had done its job, at terrible cost. I only prayed none of the crew outside my chamber had caught even a stray glimpse of it. If they had, they were likely dead or insane. I had no way of knowing, not yet. But I couldn't rest. The ship jolted again, reminding me that while I was handling my uninvited guest, the Void Caller had still been adrift in a nightmare. We weren't out of it. Stumbling, I crawled back into the navigator's throne and re-engaged the interface. My hands were trembling violently, and I felt a wave of nausea, after effects of using the lidless stare. Fighting through it, I reopened my third eye, more gingerly this time, back to its navigational focus. The warp view swam back into focus. I almost wished it hadn't. The situation was dire. We were far off the plotted course, dangerously near the heart of the warp storm. The currents were swirling around us chaotically. The Gellar Field, as I could sense through the ship's systems, was fluctuating at the brink of failure across multiple sectors of the vessel. If I didn't act fast, we'd be torn apart or completely exposed. I did the one thing I could think of that might save us, an emergency translation back to real space. It was a desperate gamble. Dropping out of warp in the middle of nowhere without proper calculations can be catastrophic. You could materialize inside a star or a planet, or an enemy's maw for that matter. But staying here was certain doom. With shaking fingers, I keyed the cogitators for an emergency translation. Normally, this requires the captain's authorization as well, but I overrode it. Navigators have that prerogative in extreme circumstances. The machine spirit of the warp drive groaned in my mind. It didn't like abrupt maneuvers any more than the rest of us. I braced as best I could and mentally shouted into the ship's telepathic circuit, "Hold on to something. Translating to real space now." Whether anyone heard that in the chaos, I'm not sure. I initiated the sequence. For the second time in mere minutes, reality bucked. A soundless implosion enveloped us as the Void Caller ripped itself out of the Immaterium's clutches. The transition was rougher than any I'd ever done. My stomach felt like it leapt through my throat. There was a blinding flash and a jolt. Gravity flickered. And then, stillness. Real space. Blessed, quiet, stable, real space. I think I lost consciousness for a few minutes at that point. When I came to, I was still strapped in my throne, head lolling. Everything was eerily silent except for the soft hum of the ship's generators and the distant sound of Yes sobbing somewhere over the Vox. I slowly removed my harness and stood on wobbly legs. Through the viewing dome above, I saw normal space, black, dotted with stars. No sign of any planet or sun immediately visible, just the endless void. In a way, it was one of the most beautiful sights I've ever seen. The warp might be visually spectacular or strange, but nothing beats the comforting pinpricks of real stars after what we'd just been through. Gradually, the bridge crew and I regained communications. Reports trickled in from all over the ship. It was bad, but it could have been far worse. The emergency translation had likely saved us, but it had exacted a toll. We lost 2 escort cutters that had been in formation with us. They didn't make it out of the warp when we did. Their fates, Emperor rest their souls, were probably horrific. Lost in the storm without a guide. Large sections of our ship had suffered warp contamination before we re-emerged. Whole compartments where reality had thinned. One engineering bay looked as if it had been turned inside out. Machinery and people fused in grotesque ways, caught in the between space of translation. The Gellar Field failure on decks 5 and 6 had allowed more creatures through. A running battle by our brave armsmen and surviving officers had eventually purged them. When we translated out, the few that entered were instantly banished, thank the throne, but not before wreaking havoc. Casualties were high. Of a crew of 10,000, we later tallied nearly 2,000 dead or missing. I heard that number and just stared blankly for a while, processing the weight of it. 2,000 lives, snuffed or shredded by the Immaterium's whims. And if I hadn't acted when I did, it would have been all of us. Cold comfort. The captain was alive, though he had a nasty wound from being thrown against a bulkhead. He convened a meeting in the aftermath, more like a war council of the traumatized. I left my chamber to attend in person, head still bandaged. I must have hit it, or perhaps it was precaution due to the blood I'd lost. When I stepped onto the bridge, the remaining crew literally stopped what they were doing and looked at me as if I were a ghost or a saint. I suppose in their eyes my appearance was startling. Navigators don't often leave their sanctums mid-journey, and here I was, pale as a sheet, uniform torn and stained, eyes bloodshot, striding onto the command deck. I could feel the fear and awe in their stares. One junior officer backed away as I passed, bowing his head, as if proximity to me was dangerous. And to be fair, sometimes it is. The captain managed a weak smile when he saw me. "Navigator," he greeted, voice rough. "It's damn good to see you in one piece." We clasped hands briefly, an unusual gesture between a Navy man and a mutant navigator. But at that moment, we were comrades who'd survived hell together. We took stock. The astropath, somehow still alive, though he had gone blind, not uncommon after intense warp turmoil, sent out hails for assistance. We had to figure out where we were, since the emergency drop was unplanned. The navigational charts pegged our coordinates roughly, and to my surprise and relief, we weren't impossibly far off course. In fact, my last desperate steering had aimed us at real space near an Imperial outpost system. Perhaps the Emperor's hand guided us after all, or maybe sheer luck. We were within a few light years of a charted system named Bellis Corona, a naval depot world, if our information was current. That was good news. It meant help was not far. It took us a day to limp to the Bellis Corona outpost. That day in real space was somber and eerie. We tended to the wounded, we consigned the dead to the void with full honors and prayers, at least those whose bodies we could recover. The ship's confessor led a somber ceremony in the hangar deck. A line of draped bodies launched out into the starry void one by one, each accompanied by the muffled thump of a salute from the honor guard. I stood at the back, listening to the final litany. The words of the prayer echoed strangely in the cavernous bay. "Emperor, receive these souls, for they served mankind." I remember gripping my cap in my hands so hard my knuckles turned white. 2,000 souls gone, and I, their guide, still living. It's a peculiar guilt, survivor's guilt, amplified by the feeling that perhaps I could have, should have, saved more. When the last coffin was sent off, I mouthed a personal vow to learn from it, to never be caught so off guard again if I could help it. Later, at dock, we were met by relief ships. The Void Caller limped into port, battered, scarred, but alive. The mission, needless to say, was a failure in terms of timely arrival. We were far too late. Other forces had intervened in the conflict we were meant to assist, and the situation had evolved. The intel we carried was delivered, but it was mostly moot by then. In the grand bureaucratic annals, our voyage would probably be logged as delayed, arrived outside expected window due to warp anomaly. Such a dry note for an experience that nearly shattered us. As for me, I spent a week in Medicaid care on that station. Physically, I recovered fast enough. A few minor warp burns, exhaustion, some neurological strain. Mentally, well, that's harder to quantify. The Navy offered me a commendation for bravery. I didn't particularly care for it. The Navi's Nobilite transmitted back a note of sympathy for my losses and subtly inquired if I was still fit to serve or needed reassignment. A polite way of suggesting maybe I'd had enough. I told them I would continue. Pride, duty, maybe a bit of madness. But I wasn't ready to retreat home with my tail between my legs. Not yet. I did notice one lingering effect of that journey. A small physical change. A few weeks after, I found a patch of my hair had turned stark white, shock white, right above my forehead. Coincidentally or not, just around the area of my third eye. Perhaps the intense use of my power left a mark. Some of my normal eyesight in one eye had also dimmed. The chirurgions said it might return, it might not. Small prices to pay, I suppose, for surviving. The crew, those who survived, were never the same either. I heard that more than a few of the Void Caller's men and women resigned their commissions after that, unable to face another warp jump. Some had seen too much, glimpses of things when the field flickered that drove them to the brink. The officer cadre held together better, but they looked at me with an even more pronounced mix of fear and reverence. To them, I was the sorcerer who fought off a demon and saved the ship. I get the sense they will whisper about me in years to come, embellishing the tale, maybe even worshipping a bit. The Imperium discourages outright superstition about navigators. We're already considered witchy enough, so I tried to dissuade any hero worship, but I know how humans are. They need legends. And the pale-eyed lord who stared down the abyss is as good a legend as any, I suppose. For my part, I had to process the guilt, too. 2,000 lives lost under my watch. Yes, I saved 8,000, but the weight of the lost sits heavily. I replayed those moments countless times in my mind, wondering what I could have done differently. Perhaps if I had insisted on a slower route, but that could have meant a different disaster elsewhere, or punishment for disobeying orders. Perhaps if I noticed the storm earlier. Unlikely. It was a freak, unpredictable. Or maybe if I hadn't wasted precious seconds facing that demon, more might have survived. But then, if I hadn't, none would have survived. These are the circular thoughts that keep one up at night, staring at the ceiling of a quiet cabin while the ship's engines thrum below. After recovery, I resumed my duties. The Void Caller was in dry dock for extensive repairs, so I was reassigned to another vessel after a time, a grand cruiser this time. They figured if I could handle what I did, I was ready for bigger responsibilities. And so I continued. Jump after jump, voyage after voyage. Each time I entered the warp, I carried with me the memory of that storm and its lessons, like scars on the psyche. One lesson above all, never underestimate the warp. The moment you think you have it under control, it will show you something new and awful. It is not a realm meant for mortals, and we mortal navigators walk its knife's edge every single time. I also gained a new nickname among some of my peers after that incident, Void-touched. It's whispered half-jokingly by other navigators who hear of such close calls. It implies one has been kissed by the warp, but returned, marked, but alive. I wear the moniker with a grim smirk. Yes, I am void-touched. You could say that about every navigator, though. We are all a bit mad, carrying little pieces of the warp's shadow in our minds. Now, you might think after such an ordeal I would have had enough, that I'd retire to some quiet estate, drink myself into a stupor, and try to forget. Trust me, the thought crossed my mind in dark moments. But what else was I going to do? This is what I am. This is what I was born for. If anything, surviving that hellish detour gave me a weird kind of confidence. Not arrogance. Emperor, no, I was humbled. But confidence that if the worst came at me, I might just have the grit to push back. And if I didn't, well, I wouldn't be around to regret it. Still, I'd be lying if I said I emerged without trauma. For months after, my dreams were blood-soaked and filled with screams. I'd jolt awake thinking I heard the demon's voice or the dying shrieks of crew. There were nights I avoided sleep entirely, wandering the ship's corridors instead. The void of real space between translations became oddly comforting. At least out there, I could pretend everything was normal. In the quiet, I often found myself heading to the observation deck, a glass-walled promenade where off-duty crew sometimes go to gaze at the stars. Usually, it'd be empty when I went at 0300. I'd stand there and just look out at the endless black, sprinkled with light, and marvel at how something so peaceful could be one side of a coin whose other face was unspeakable horror. The warp and real space. Two sides of reality. And we navigators stand right at the seam, peeking behind the curtain so that humanity can keep trudging along on the safe side. I suppose that's the heart of it, isn't it? The horrifying life of a navigator. It's about standing guard on the threshold of hell so that billions of others can live their lives oblivious under the warm sun of some distant world, never knowing how thin the wall between their reality and nightmare truly is. If we do our job right, they never have to think about it. They can't know. If the average citizen glimpsed for a second what I see routinely, they'd probably lose their mind just from the revelation of it. Sometimes I envy them, the common folk. Ignorance, as they say, is bliss. There's a man out there on some agri-world whose biggest worry is whether the harvest will be good or if his daughter will marry the baker's son. That man sleeps soundly under a sky of stars at night. He doesn't realize that far above, ships like mine carry brave fools like me through nightmares to ensure his world keeps turning. If he did, perhaps he'd erect a statue to the navigators alongside the Emperor. Or more likely, he'd burn us as witches, given human nature. Maybe it's better they remain unaware and slightly afraid of us. rather than informed and wholly terrified. After that infamous voyage, my perspective shifted. I became a bit more cynical, a bit more sardonically humorous, perhaps. Dry sarcasm became my shield. When faced with a new challenge, I'd often quip something like, "Well, it can't be worse than that one time, can it?" The crew didn't always appreciate my humor, but it kept me sane. For instance, on a later assignment, a young cadet once asked me, with the innocent curiosity only the young have, what the warp is truly like. We were about to make a jump and he was clearly scared. I looked at him thoughtfully and answered, "Imagine the worst nightmare you've ever had. Now imagine it's real and you're sailing a ship through it while blindfolded. But don't worry," I added with a wink, "most of the time the nightmare ignores you. Most of the time." The cadet's eyes bulged, and he quickly found an excuse to be elsewhere. Okay, perhaps not the kindest thing I've done. I did call him aside later and gave a more reassuring pat on the shoulder. But really, I don't think sugarcoating does anyone favors. Fear keeps you alive out there, so long as it doesn't paralyze you. You might wonder, with all this gloom and horror, is there any joy in a navigator's life? It's a valid question. We sacrifice a lot, our normalcy, our safety, often our health, and eventually our appearances. We're isolated by duty and by others' fear. Do we find happiness in anything? The answer is we do, in our own peculiar ways. For one, there is a profound satisfaction in guiding a ship safely through the warp and seeing it arrive at its destination. It's like threading a needle with a hurricane raging around you and somehow succeeding. Every time I complete a voyage and hear the cheer of the crew as the planet we seek comes into view, I feel a quiet pride. I'll never be celebrated with parades or anything. Nobody throws a parade for arrived mostly on time with minimal soul eating. But I know, and that's enough. Then there are the small pleasures. A cup of recaf that hasn't gone cold, shared with a colleague after a rough transit. A moment of genuine camaraderie when the captain claps your shoulder and says, "Good work, navigator," after dodging some warp perturbation. The rare but treasured friendships with those who see past the third eye. I've had a few. A Mechanicus Magos who valued me because to him everything was just biology, and he was fascinated rather than repulsed. A commissar who, ironically, found my gallows humor delightful and often invited me for a game of regicide between missions. Such connections are few, but all the more precious. And of course, some navigators find solace in more hedonistic pursuits. We have money and privilege after all. Some dive into wine, narcotics, the companionship of paid courtesans in void ports. I understand the impulse, drown the nightmares in pleasure. I've tasted some of that, but moderately. I prefer to keep a somewhat clear head. I need all the wits I have, shredded as they may be, the next time I'm in the soup. Also, believe it or not, navigators can have families, can love. Arranged marriages aside, sometimes genuine bonds form. I knew one navigator couple who insisted on traveling together on the same ship, taking shifts at the helm so each could rest in turn. They were odd to behold. He was rail-thin and 7 feet tall. She was tiny and bird-like with jet-black eyes, quite the pair. But they had a tenderness that made the darkness around them seem almost irrelevant. So yes, there are rays of light. For me, love in the traditional sense, well, it's complicated. My house did, of course, attempt to arrange a suitable marriage for me at one point, a union with a second cousin from another navigator house meant to strengthen our bloodline. We met at a grand ball, exchanged some stiff pleasantries. She was polite, I was awkward. Neither of us was particularly keen on the idea. She had her own assignments among the stars, and I was practically living on void ships by then. In the end, that arrangement fizzled out quietly with no hard feelings. I think both families were too busy with other crises to force the issue, and that was just as well. The one time I felt a true spark outside such formalities was, Emperor helped me with a normal human, a scholar aboard a diplomatic vessel. She was brilliant, witty, one of the few who dared converse at length with the strange navigator. For a brief few weeks, I thought, perhaps, but in the end, I pulled away. I'd seen too vividly what mixing my world and hers could result in. Better she find someone planet-side, a nice ordinary life. I'm married to the stars, as the saying goes, or married to the warp, which is a rather abusive spouse, but I digress. I did eventually return home to Terra for a short period, some years after the Void Caller incident. It was customary, a pilgrimage to the Navigator's quarter to report in person, and also to gene test. The houses like to ensure we haven't picked up any unsanctioned mutations that could threaten breeding purity. There's also the matter of paying respects to the Paternova, the grand head of all navigators, who dwells somewhere in splendid isolation on Terra, linked to all of us in ways we barely grasp. Some say when the Paternova eventually dies, all navigators will feel it, and our powers will wane until a new one rises. Comforting, isn't it? Our abilities tied to an ancient being we never meet until he croaks and plunges us into crisis. Anyway, I digress. On Terra, among my own, I felt strangely out of place. I'd changed. The young man who left with big eyes, 3 of them, full of ambition, was gone. In his place was this world-weary voidfarer with a streak of white in his hair and a cynical bend to his smile. My family noticed. My mother said I looked aged. I was barely 30 by then, but I suppose stress can do that. There's a saying, warp touch ages the soul. I believe it. The grand mansion felt smaller somehow, or maybe it was I who had grown. The concerns of house politics, who's marrying whom, which house slighted which in some trade agreement, all of it felt trivial after what I'd seen. I attended a banquet where a rather pompous distant relative was bragging about his successful run ferrying a cardinal through a mild warp route, acting as if he'd personally wrestled a demon for the man's soul, when in truth he likely saw nothing worse than a flicker of Chaos's little finger. I recall downing my glass and interjecting quietly with, "Tell us about the time your Gellar Field failed, cousin. How did you handle that?" The table fell silent. He stammered that such a thing never happened to him. I smiled thinly and said, "Pity. One hasn't truly tested one's mettle until it does." Yes, it was petty. I got a scolding later for embarrassing a fellow navigator publicly. But honestly, there's a divide between those of us who've been through the fire and those who've only read about it. I used to be the latter. Now I was the former, and I found I had less patience for boasting and bureaucracy. I didn't stay on Terra long. I itched to get back to the stars, ironically to return to that danger. There's something addictive about it in a way. Not the horror, but the importance. Out there, doing the job, I mattered. All the nightmares and sacrifices had meaning because I was literally holding the fate of thousands in my hands each trip. Back home, amidst luxury and idle talk, I felt superfluous. Plus, whenever I looked up at the filtered sky of Terra, I didn't see the heavens I knew. The Astronomican's glow overhead almost taunted me, calling me back. So I left again, on to more voyages, more chapters in this bizarre life. There were other incidents, of course, though none quite as harrowing as the one I detailed. I've encountered false alarms and real ones, navigated war zones where the psychic backlash of millions dying caused the warp to seethe. That's always unsettling, the echo of slaughter amplifying the Immaterium's ferocity. I once guided a ship through a stretch of the warp that had gone eerily calm, Too calm, like the eye of a hurricane. That was almost worse because we knew it couldn't last. We emerged and hours later got word that in the wider galaxy, the Great Rift had torn open, that colossal new rent in reality that split the Imperium in half. We had somehow slipped through just before the storm. Had our journey been a day later, we might have been caught right as the galaxy truly went to hell in a handbasket. That gave me chills. Sometimes it's not just personal or local events, but cosmic ones, and we are all but leaves on those tides. Throughout their naturally long lives, many navigators never cease to grow in size. Some develop what we call heir apparent traits, gill-like organs, massive stature, if they are fated to become the next Paternova. I'm in no hurry for that. It entails all the other potential heirs trying to assassinate each other in a bizarre metamorphic free-for-all, or so the lore goes. But it's a reminder that even among ourselves, we have an evolutionary endgame beyond just our daily toil. Sometimes I wonder if I'll live long enough to see those changes in myself. It's an unsettling thought, turning into some giant guild proto-Paternova. But that, if it comes, will be centuries from now. No point losing sleep over it today. Throughout all these experiences, I retained one constant. I did my job. No matter what happened, war, peace, tragedy, or triumph, I went to my post, I guided the ships entrusted to me, and I brought as many people safely through the void as Emperor allowed. Now, before I wrap up, there are a few other odd chapters of this navigator's life that deserve mention. Little side trips, if you will, on this journey of mine. Not every danger comes with fangs and fire. Some are subtle or even bureaucratic. For instance, the forces of the Imperium I serve so loyally have not always been understanding of what we navigators endure. I recall after the Void Caller incident, while we were docked at Bellis Corona, we received an unexpected guest, an agent of the Holy Inquisition. Yes, those Emperor-blessed watchdogs who sniff out heresy under every bed. It seems word of a major warp incursion and high casualties drew their attention, and they wanted to make sure nothing tainted had hitched a ride back with us, or taken root in me. I was summoned to an interview, which is a polite way of saying interrogation, with Inquisitor Halgrim, a dour man in a black cloak, sporting the silver eye emblem on his chest, and a cybernetic eye that whirred softly as it sized me up. The meeting room was sparse, just steel walls, a table, 2 chairs, and an Aquila insignia glaring from the ceiling as if the God Emperor himself were watching. "Navigator," he began without preamble, "I trust you understand why I'm here." I gave a small nod. "To ensure the warp left no mark on me or my crew, I assume." He narrowed his organic eye. "Quite. Explain to me in detail what occurred during translation." So I did. Calmly, clinically, I recounted the events. The storm, the demon incursion, the emergency translation. I left out nothing, not even my use of the lidless stare to banish the creature. If anything was likely to alarm him, that part would. A navigator unleashing such power is a fine line to tread. All the while, he watched me like a hawk. I could practically feel the suspicion radiating off him. When I finished, he steepled his fingers. There was a long silence, broken only by the faint hum of the room's luminators. Finally, Halgrim spoke, each word sharp. "Many would consider what you did extremely perilous. You opened a direct conduit to the warp from within a ship. Do you expect me to believe no corruption tainted you in that moment?" I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. Not a wise gesture with Inquisitors. Inquisitor, the only thing that touched me was a splitting headache and a nosebleed. I assure you I performed rites of purgation afterward and submitted myself to the ship's confessor for blessing. I have fought the warp my entire life. I have no interest in inviting it in. He studied me for an uncomfortably long time. I met his gaze steadily, two-eyed, letting him search for any flicker of deceit. Inside, I was slightly simmering. Here I was, basically being accused of potential heresy after saving an entire ship. But I kept that to myself. At length, Halgrim stood up. For now, Navigator, I am satisfied, but be vigilant. Should you notice any change in your thoughts or dreams, report it at once. The touch of chaos can be subtle. I forced a thin smile. Believe me, Inquisitor, if chaos tries to rent space in my head, it'll find the neighborhood quite inhospitable. He didn't smile back. Humorless lot, the Inquisition. With a last scrutinizing glance, he left. The verdict, no charges, no censure. Just a lingering cloud of distrust. It bothered me at first, the injustice of being suspected by those I serve. But I came to accept it as part of the Imperium's nature. Fear and suspicion are the glue that hold this empire together, for better or worse. And to be fair, there have been navigators who fell to corruption or madness, wreaking untold havoc. The Inquisition has executed a few of my kind over the centuries for trafficking with demons, or worse, so I don't begrudge them their caution. Still, it's a thankless feeling to be on the receiving end after literally walking through hell for the Imperium's sake. Speaking of others of my kind, not all my interactions with fellow navigators have been tea and crumpets either. The Navis Nobilite is a family, yes, but often a fractious one. Our houses compete for contracts, status, power. I've had run-ins with rivals that almost ended as badly as some warp creature encounters. One particular episode comes to mind, a dispute between my house and another, House Farachi, over who would supply navigators to a wealthy rogue trader's fleet. It was a lucrative assignment with lots of trade route mileage and profits. Both houses wanted it badly. I was the candidate from my side, moderately experienced, with a decent reputation after a string of successful voyages post-Voidcaller. House Farachi put forth their scion, a man named Calder, older than me and arrogant as a warlord. We'd met once before, and it was dislike at first sight. When negotiations turned heated, this Calder fellow made a snide remark at a formal gathering. Something about my brush with disaster. He referred to the Voidcaller incident, proving I was unlucky. He insinuated that trusting me was courting catastrophe. I smiled and responded with equal venom, noting that he'd never been tested beyond milk runs and that his confidence perhaps outstripped his talent. Things escalated, as they do when prideful mutants with generational egos clash. The rogue trader jokingly suggested we duel for it. To his surprise, Calder and I both agreed. It's not common to duel in the literal sense. We're not exactly practiced swordsmen. But navigators have their own form of duel, a contest of warp scrying and third-eye prowess. We arranged a formal competition in the presence of judges from a neutral navigator house. Each of us would perform a series of warp navigation challenges, simulated, of course, using astral maps and psychic projections, to demonstrate who had the finer skill and will. At the end, if it was close, there was even talk of a direct third-eye face-off, basically a staring contest with our warp sight with very controlled rules, so we didn't kill each other. Dangerous? Absolutely. But sometimes pride overwhelms caution. The duel itself was intense. We stood in a grand chamber in the Navigator's Quarter on Terra, beneath a fresco of the Emperor bestowing a charter upon the first navigators. A possibly apocryphal scene, but inspiring nonetheless. Around us gathered a small crowd of vested interests, my mother among them, glaring daggers at Calder on my behalf. In the first challenge, chart casting, we each had to interpret a particularly convoluted warp route through an uncharted region, guessing where safe passages might lie. I answered with careful logic. Calder answered with flamboyant certainty. The judges noted our reasoning. Next came psychic sensing, identifying faint signals from distant astropathic choir recordings. A test of warp ear, so to speak. I detected 4 out of 5 hidden messages correctly. Calder managed 3, though he argued one was a trick question. Finally, we indeed decided on a direct warp-eye duel. Both of us stood at opposite ends of a circular mosaic on the floor, removed our eye coverings, and opened our third eyes. Not to full lethal power, but in a controlled manner to emit and resist a mental pressure. It's like arm wrestling with your soul. The trick is to project strength without actually unleashing the lidless stare. We locked gazes, or rather our warp eyes locked. I kept my normal eyes shut to focus. Immediately, I felt his will pressing on mine, a wave of heat and aggression. He was powerful, I'll give him that. My temples throbbed as I countered, pushing back with a disciplined, cool force. The memory of holding steady in real warp storms gave me an edge in endurance. For what felt like minutes, but was likely seconds, we stood there, sweat dribbling down our faces, the air between us shimmering with unseen energies. In my mind, I saw a vision of a great bull, his psychic image, charging at a robed figure, mine. Each time it neared, the robed figure sidestepped and whacked the bull's flank with a staff, refusing to be gored. In the end, Calder faltered first. He let out a grunt, taking an inadvertent step back to steady himself, a clear sign of yielding. I almost collapsed right after, but managed to bow my head as if in control, politely covering my warp eye again. The judges declared me the victor. House Faraci was livid, my own house smug. Truth be told, it was a hollow win in some ways. I got the assignment, I served with that rogue trader fleet for a time, but Calder nursed a grudge. Years later, I heard he got his revenge in political ways, swaying a contract with the Administratum away from us by bribery and marriage alliance. Such is Navigator intrigue. We duel with psychic might one day, and with paperwork and pedigrees the next. I share this to illustrate that beyond the grand cosmic horror, we navigators also deal in petty feuds, ambition, and all too human folly. We might be mutants, but we're still people with all the baggage that entails. Now, another facet of warp travel I've only touched on lightly: time. Time in the warp is a funny thing. Funny as in a cruel joke. It doesn't flow reliably. We've talked about being lost or arriving late, but let me give a concrete example from my own voyages. On a relatively routine trip, this was after I'd recovered and taken a post on that grand cruiser I mentioned, we set out from Port Sanctus to a forge world called Cellarant. I estimated a 2-week translation given moderate warp currents. For most of the journey, everything seemed fine. Compared to the nightmares I'd seen, it was downright boring. We encountered some minor eddies, a bit of turbulence, nothing serious. I even remember writing some correspondence to a friend during the quiet stretches, planning to send it once we arrived. We did arrive safely and exactly where we intended in real space. Only one problem: the calendar didn't match. According to ship chronometers, we'd spent 14 days in warp. But when we hailed Cellarant, the replies were sluggish and confused. Eventually, an adept on the planet informed us that the current year was 5 years later than what our shipboard time said. 5 years had passed in real space. At first, I thought it a mistake. Perhaps our clocks malfunctioned. Perhaps Cellarant's logs were off. But verification through astropathic channels confirmed the awful truth. We had experienced a major temporal dilation. The warp had held us in its grasp, in some bubble of slower time, and while we quietly sailed along thinking all was well, the universe moved on without us for half a decade. The fallout of that was tragic in its own quiet way. Messages came through for crew members. One man's family, assuming him dead, had perished in a plague in year 3 of our absence. because the relief we carried arrived too late. A young ensign broke down sobbing when she learned her fiancé had married someone else a year ago, thinking she'd never return. Even I was not spared. I learned that a colleague and friend of mine in the Navigator ranks had died 2 years prior in a Hive City riot, and I hadn't been there to attend his memorial. We'd survived the warp's teeth and claws, only to be wounded by its trickery with time. And the cruelest part? There was no one to fight, nothing to fix, no demon to shoot or exorcise. Just the reality of lost years, stolen by the void. I think that was one of the most depressing voyages I ever completed, and there was no grand recognition or recompense. How do you punish the warp for stealing time? The Administratum certainly doesn't refund it. They simply adjust their ledgers and carry on. After incidents like that, I sometimes question whether any of this makes a difference. We struggle so much, we try to bring order to something inherently capricious, and yet the warp can still effectively say no and make a mockery of our plans without even sending a single monster. But then I remind myself, if not for navigators, such temporal mishaps would be the least of humanity's worries. Without us, no ships would travel at all, or they'd drift aimlessly for centuries. So a late arrival is better than never arriving, and our efforts are not in vain, even when imperfect. Finally, I'd like to mention something on the more philosophical end. Bear with me. Lengthy warp transits can make one a bit of a philosopher, nothing like drifting in unreality to prompt existential thoughts. Over the years, I've developed a strange sense of kinship with the warp itself. Not affection, Emperor forbid, but kinship in the sense that it is the canvas I paint my work on, the adversary I spar with daily. The warp is the ocean, and I am a sailor. You can hate the storm, curse it, fear it, but you also must respect it, and in a twisted way, know it intimately. I've seen its terrible beauty, the way raw emotion and souls manifest as light and energy. I've navigated by its peculiar landmarks, whirlpools of hatred, currents of despair, islands of calm formed by faith or hope. These are not just poetic metaphors. I genuinely perceive those qualities out there. It's as if all the dreams, nightmares, and passions of every living being flow into that sea and create weather patterns. In that sense, the warp is a reflection of us, of life. That doesn't redeem its horrors, but it puts into perspective that chaos isn't just some external demon realm, though it is that too. It's also our collective shadow. When I'm feeling particularly wistful, perhaps after a second glass of Amasec, I've even thought navigators, by guiding ships through the warp, are like mediators between the material and immaterial halves of human existence. We dip into the subconscious made manifest and steer the course, ensuring that our species' hopes, the worlds and futures we strive for, aren't drowned by our fears, the literal demons spawned from our worst impulses. A fanciful notion, maybe. But at 3 a.m. ship time, staring into the void, these are the thoughts that surface. Don't worry, I'm not about to start a Navigator poetry club or anything, though wouldn't that be something? Ode to a Gellar Field has a nice ring. One more thing I'd like to convey is the role of the Emperor, or rather his great beacon, the Astronomican, in a navigator's life. I mentioned how we steer by that light, but I haven't described what it feels like. Imagine the most comforting presence you can, a warmth in the soul that cuts through even the deepest fear. That's what the Astronomican can be for us. When I was near Terra, the Astronomican was so strong in my perceptions it was almost overwhelming. A chorus of psychic harmony that drowned out all the distant whispers of the warp. In those moments, I understood why some call it the Emperor's divine light. It felt inviolable. Conversely, I've been out on the fringes, far from Terra, where the Astronomican's glow is faint, like a lone candle in a huge, drafty hall. Out there, you feel truly alone. I remember a voyage in the eastern fringe, beyond the Astronomican's reliable reach. For the first time, I couldn't immediately find the Emperor's light upon entering warp. It was there, but oh so dim and flickering. I had to rely on memory and secondary cues more than ever. The unease that crept into my heart was palpable. It was as if I'd suddenly gone night-blind. You don't realize how much you count on that beacon until it's barely there. When we finally moved back into range and I sensed that familiar golden glow strengthen, I nearly cried with relief. Not that I'd admit that to the crew. To them, I was stoic as ever, but inside I was thanking the Emperor with every fiber of my being. So yes, we navigators have a peculiar relationship with faith. Many of us are devout in our own odd ways. How could we not be when we literally navigate by the light of what we deem the Emperor's will? Even so, we're not zealots. We can't afford to be blinded by dogma when clear-eyed focus is needed. But in the quiet moments, most of us whisper a prayer or two. I certainly do, despite my sarcasm. After all, when you stand on the edge of hell, it doesn't hurt to have a god, or god-emperor, watching your back, or at least to believe he is. Not all interactions in my career were grim or adversarial. I've met some remarkable individuals who showed genuine gratitude, or at least respect for what I do. Once I had the honor of transporting a venerable Magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus. He was an arch-engineer, half his body a whirring contraption of brass and red robes. I expected him to treat me like many Mechanicus treat humans, as an inferior, illogical being. To my surprise, he instead peppered me with polite questions about the warp and my navigation techniques. The Magos was genuinely fascinated, referring to me as esteemed guide of the Imperium. That might be the loftiest title I've ever been given. When I safely delivered him to his destination, a remote forge world, he presented me with a small gift, a cogwheel amulet inscribed with a binary prayer for safe travel. Even the Omnissiah acknowledges the skill of the Emperor's navigators, he said. Coming from a tech priest, that was high praise indeed. I keep that amulet tucked in my navigator's throne to this day. It's probably just superstition, but I like to think it harmonizes the machine spirit of the ship with my efforts. Another time, a regimental colonel, a stern woman who'd fought in countless void battles, actually sought me out after a campaign to personally thank me. "Never lost a ship under your watch," she said gruffly, handing me a bottle of vintage Amasec. "Fine work, navigator." I was so startled by the straightforward appreciation, I nearly forgot to respond. Usually, people assume someone else would have gotten them there, or they just don't think about it at all. I gave her a polite bow and said, "Glad to be of service, Colonel." "Emperor protects," to which she clinked the bottle lightly and responded, "I and you as well." Coming from a hard-bitten guardsman, that was practically a hug. Moments like those stand out because they are rare. We do our jobs in the background, and the reward is mostly that we get to live to do it again. So any human acknowledgement shines bright in my memory. It reminds me that, despite the isolation, we're still part of the larger human endeavor. They fight the wars. We get them there, each of us contributing. I'd be remiss not to mention the broader events shaping warp travel today. When that great rift, the massive tear in reality, also called the Cicatrix Maledictum, opened across the galaxy not long ago, we navigators all felt it like a dagger to the heart. Half the stars went dark to our inner sight, the Astronomican cut off beyond the scar. For those of us translating when it happened, it was pandemonium. I was lucky to be in port at the time, but the horror stories from my colleagues. I heard of one ship lost entirely when the light vanished and the navigator's mind snapped under the sudden blackness. Many others had to make emergency drops like I did during that storm. emerging far off course and terrified. We eventually adapted. Humanity always does. And with Lord Guilliman's guidance, yes, I mean Robert Guilliman, the Primarch, who would have thought I'd live to see one of the Emperor's own sons walking among us again. New routes were charted, but warp travel post-Rift is even more perilous than before. The galaxy's split means longer journeys through turbulent regions, and sometimes navigators in the dark Imperium, the far side of the Rift, have only faint secondary beacons or sheer guesswork to go on. I count myself fortunate to remain on the Terra-lit side most of the time. Still, even there, the warp has become more aggressive, as if the fabric of reality was irrevocably weakened. The nightmares have been cranked up a notch across the board. Good thing we're all a little void-mad already, or this new era would be impossible to bear. All right, I think I've painted as full a picture as I can of this life. The good, the bad, the horrifying, the absurd. The picture is painted in broad, bloody strokes and subtle hues alike. If you've listened this long, perhaps you'll take away a new appreciation for the silent figures who sit in spires above your starship's bridge, or for those strange, pallid nobles who walk past you in void-port corridors with third-eye symbols stitched into their hoods. We are navigators, by mutation, by training, by the grace of the Emperor, or so we believe. We toil so that humanity can keep finding its way through the night. The next time you make a prayer for safe travel, spare a line for us, the ones who must answer that prayer with action. And should your path ever cross with the navigators, maybe don't recoil quite so much. Instead, offer a nod of thanks. From a safe distance, of course. I won't fault you that. As for me personally, after all I've been through, I still have the warp in my blood. That itch to venture out there remains, tinged with dread though it may be. The stars call, and I must go. Because that's what I do. That's what we do. One day, perhaps, mankind will no longer need the likes of us. There's talk in esoteric circles of rediscovering ancient technologies, stable warp gates, the fabled webway of the Eldar. Who knows? If that day comes, I'll gladly hang up my cloak and let someone else take on the mantle of guiding humanity's journeys. But until then, the navigators will be on duty. We'll be there, charting the unchartable, fighting the unwinnable fights in the shadows of reality, and cracking dry jokes about it afterward over a cup of recaf, or something stronger. And if the darkness ever seems too deep, I remember this. Out there on some ship, another navigator like me is peering into the void at this very moment, whispering the same quiet mantra. Steady now, Emperor, guide us. Not today. We're never truly alone in the warp. For better or worse, our brethren are all navigating their own nightmares, each a light in the dark helping to connect the vastness of the Imperium. All right, enough of that. I think I've rambled on long enough with the ravings of a warp-eyed man. It's time I get back to work. The void's waiting, my shipmates are counting on me, and I have to double-check that the Gellar Field coils aren't rattling. Paranoia is another lasting gift of my experiences. One last swig of recaf, one last deep breath of relatively untainted air, and I'll ascend to my chamber and strap in. As I like to say before a jump, well, here goes everything. Not today, Immaterium, not today.